The lunch she'd packed for work remained on the kitchen counter. The suburb of Westerville, Ohio, typically bustled quietly on weekday mornings. Lawns were trimmed, mailboxes stood sentinel, and the sound of cars heading out for the day provided a predictable rhythm. On this particular Tuesday in late spring, however, the rhythm in one modest house on Maple Drive was subtly broken. By mid-afternoon, the neighbors noticed the car was still in the driveway. The curtains remained drawn. It was unusual for Sarah Jenkins, a 28-year-old graphic designer known for her punctuality and routine. Sarah lived alone in the house she had recently purchased, a small bungalow with a well-tended flower garden. She was close to her mother, Linda, who lived only a few streets away. Their relationship had been navigating some recent turbulence, a quiet tension felt by those who knew them well. Sarah had recently ended a significant relationship with Mark Peterson, a man she had dated for over 2 years. The breakup had been difficult, marked by lingering feelings and unresolved issues. Calls to Sarah's phone went unanswered. Her office reported she hadn't arrived for work and hadn't called in sick. This was highly uncharacteristic. Friends and family began to worry as the hours passed. By early evening, Linda Jenkins went to her daughter's house. She found the front door unlocked, the house silent. Inside, the air was still, the carefully arranged living room undisturbed. The lunch bag on the counter was the first stark indicator that the morning had not proceeded as planned. Linda searched the house, a growing sense of dread tightening in her chest. Sarah wasn't there. Her car was outside. Her purse and keys were inside. Panic began to set in. Linda contacted the Westerville Police Department, reporting her daughter missing. Officers were dispatched to the Maple Drive address to take the initial report and conduct a cursory check of the property. They noted no signs of forced entry, no immediate indicators of a struggle within the main living areas. The missing person report initiated a standard procedure. Officers gathered information about Sarah, her habits, her recent activities, and the people closest to her. They spoke with Linda Jenkins, who appeared distressed but composed. They also spoke briefly with Mark Peterson, Sarah's ex-boyfriend, who stated he hadn't seen or spoken to Sarah in several days. He expressed concern upon hearing she was missing. These initial conversations were brief, intended only to gather leads for the search. As the evening wore on, the search expanded. Friends and family joined police officers in canvassing the neighborhood, calling Sarah's name, checking local parks and common areas. The quiet suburban streets felt different under the glare of flashlights and the hushed urgency of the search party. The car remaining in the driveway, the uneaten lunch, the unanswered phone, these small details solidified into a heavy certainty that something was profoundly wrong. The search continued throughout the night, hope diminished with every passing hour. Investigators reviewed the missing person report, focusing on anyone Sarah might have had recent contact with, or anyone who might have reason to harm her. The recent breakup with Mark Peterson was noted, as were the complexities of her relationship with her mother. At this stage, however, there was no evidence pointing definitively to foul play or specific suspects. It was simply a young woman who had vanished from her seemingly ordinary life, leaving behind only the quiet, unsettling tableau of her undisturbed home and the untouched lunch bag on the counter. The night air grew cold, and the uncertainty of Sarah's fate hung heavy over Maple Drive. The call came just before dawn. A resident walking their dog in a wooded area on the outskirts of Westerville, less than 3 miles from Sarah Jenkins' home on Maple Drive, discovered something disturbing. Off a less-used trail, partially concealed by dense underbrush, lay a body. First responders arrived quickly, securing the scene and confirming the worst fears. It was Sarah Jenkins. The crime scene was grim. Yellow tape cordoned off the area. Investigators from the Westerville Police Department and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation (BCI) were called in. The initial assessment by the first responding officers noted the apparent location of the body and its general condition. The specific details of the discovery were immediately sensitive, reserved for the lead investigators and forensic teams. The body was found several miles from her home, raising immediate questions about how she got there. The scene was processed meticulously. Forensic technicians documented everything: the position of the body, any visible injuries, trace evidence on the surrounding ground, disturbed vegetation. They worked carefully, systematically, under the dawning light. Evidence markers dotted the area, indicating items of interest or points for documentation. The soil, the leaves, the air itself, seemed to hold secrets. The preliminary assessment at the scene indicated that Sarah had likely been deceased for several hours, placing the time of death sometime the previous day, consistent with when she was reported missing. The cause of death was not immediately apparent without a full autopsy, but the circumstances surrounding the discovery pointed strongly towards homicide. The remote location, the concealment of the body, these suggested deliberate action. News of the discovery spread quickly through the small community, shattering the morning's fragile peace. Neighbors on Maple Drive woke to see police cars still parked near Sarah's house, the activity now taking on a more somber, focused air. A uniformed officer stood guard near the front door, a stark visual representation of the tragedy that had unfolded. The quiet street, hours before filled with the anxious energy of a search, now felt heavy with grief and unanswered questions. Investigators began the complex task of reconstructing Sarah's final hours. This involved interviewing everyone who had seen or spoken to her on Monday. Friends, coworkers, family members were asked to recount their last interactions, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Every detail was crucial in building a timeline. Who was the last person to see Sarah alive? What was her mood? Did she mention any plans, any concerns? The interviews extended to those closest to her, including her mother, Linda Jenkins, and her ex-boyfriend, Mark Peterson. Linda provided a tearful account of realizing her daughter was missing and discovering the empty house. Mark reiterated that he hadn't been in contact with Sarah recently. Both offered alibis for Monday. These initial statements were taken down carefully, to be corroborated and scrutinized later. The focus was broad initially, examining Sarah's relationships, her work, her social life, searching for any potential conflict or threat. The remote wooded area where her body was found offered few immediate clues about the perpetrator, only the chilling reality of her final resting place. The investigation had shifted from a missing person case to a full-scale homicide inquiry, and the weight of that reality settled heavily on the quiet streets of Westerville. The autopsy was conducted by the county coroner's office later that day. Dr. Emily Carter, the forensic pathologist, provided the first concrete medical findings regarding Sarah Jenkins' death. The report detailed the cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. The nature and severity of the injuries indicated a forceful attack. The report also provided a more precise estimated time of death, narrowing the window to sometime between late morning and early afternoon on Monday. Investigators received the preliminary autopsy report, which confirmed their suspicions of homicide. The findings provided crucial details about the nature of the attack and the potential weapon used. Although a specific weapon was not recovered at the scene, the focus of the investigation intensified, shifting towards identifying who might have had the opportunity and motive to inflict such violence upon Sarah. The timeline became paramount. Who was where between 10:00 a.m. and 2:00 p.m. on Monday? Detectives revisited the interviews with Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson, as well as other acquaintances of Sarah. They sought to verify the alibis provided and explore any potential inconsistencies. Linda maintained she had spent the day at home, running errands locally. Mark stated he was at his job outside of Westerville for most of the day. These statements were the first points of focus for verification. Investigators also began collecting digital evidence. Sarah's phone records, computer activity, and social media presence were examined for any clues about her state of mind, her interactions, or potential threats. Simultaneously, efforts were made to obtain phone records for those closest to her, including Linda and Mark, to establish their movements and communications on the day of the murder. This was a standard step in any homicide investigation, aiming to build a comprehensive picture of who was in contact with whom and when. Witness interviews continued. Neighbors, coworkers, friends, everyone was asked to recall anything unusual they might have observed in the days leading up to Sarah's disappearance and death. Had she seemed troubled? Had she mentioned any problems? Had anyone seen any unfamiliar vehicles or individuals near her house? Small details, seemingly insignificant at the time they occurred, could take on new meaning in the context of a murder investigation. During interviews with Sarah's friends, a pattern began to emerge regarding the complexities of her family life and her recent breakup. Friends described Sarah as being deeply hurt by the split from Mark. They also mentioned her relationship with her mother had been strained recently, though the exact reasons were often unclear to them. One friend recalled Sarah mentioning feeling caught in the middle of something, Though she hadn't elaborated, investigators began to look more closely at the relationship dynamics between Sarah, Linda, and Mark. While a breakup is common, the added layer of family strain was noted. Detectives learned that Linda and Mark had known each other for several years through Sarah. They had appeared friendly, though there was no indication of anything beyond that before the breakup. Now, investigators wondered if the recent tension between Sarah and Linda was connected to Mark. Was there something more to the story than a simple breakup and family disagreement? The answers lay hidden in the recent past, in the private interactions of three people bound by complicated ties. The initial layer of grief and shock was beginning to peel away, revealing a substratum of potential conflict and hidden secrets. The untouched lunch remained a silent, haunting symbol of a life abruptly stopped. The investigation took a significant turn when detectives obtained the detailed phone records for Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson for the crucial period around Sarah's death. These records revealed a startling pattern of communication that contradicted their initial statements. Contrary to Mark's claim of little recent contact, his phone records showed numerous calls and texts between him and Linda in the weeks leading up to Sarah's death, and specifically on the day she went missing. Further analysis of the content of these communications, obtained through warrants, unveiled a secret relationship. Text messages and call logs indicated Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson had become intimately involved shortly after Sarah and Mark broke up. The messages were discreet but left little doubt about the nature of their connection. Some messages hinted at meetings arranged in secret, concerns about being discovered, and discussions that alluded to Sarah's feelings and potential reactions if she were to find out. This discovery fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. The woman who had reported her daughter missing, and the man who was the daughter's recent ex-boyfriend, were involved in a clandestine affair. This provided a powerful potential motive, previously unconsidered: the affair being discovered or the fear of it being discovered. Detectives brought Linda and Mark in for separate, more pointed interviews. Confronted with the phone records and communications, their initial composure crumbled. Linda initially denied the affair, then admitted to it under pressure, explaining it had begun innocently after she and Mark bonded over the difficult breakup Sarah was experiencing. She claimed it became romantic unintentionally. Mark also admitted the affair, describing it as a complicated situation that just happened. Investigators pressed them on whether Sarah knew about the relationship. Linda claimed Sarah did not know. Mark was less certain, acknowledging Sarah had seemed distant and withdrawn recently, but stating he didn't think she knew about him and her mother. However, some of the retrieved text messages between Linda and Mark revealed discussions expressing anxiety about Sarah's suspicions or her proximity to discovering the truth. The timeline of their communication on Monday, the day Sarah died, was particularly scrutinized. Records showed calls and texts between Linda and Mark throughout the morning and early afternoon, overlapping precisely with the estimated time of Sarah's death. The content of some messages became more urgent and panicked in the afternoon. One message from Linda to Mark read, "We need to talk. Now. Something's happened," sent shortly before she reported Sarah missing. The revelation of the affair provided a dramatic new lens through which to view the evidence. The strain in Sarah's relationship with her mother, previously vague, now had a concrete, devastating explanation. The complex dynamics of the broken relationship with Mark were now intertwined with a profound betrayal by the person Sarah should have been able to trust most. The quiet suburb of Westerville, known for its peaceful streets, now held the chilling secret of a mother's unthinkable act of betrayal, a secret that investigators increasingly suspected was connected to her daughter's violent end. The meticulous work of piecing together phone records and witness statements had cracked the surface, revealing the dark currents beneath the calm exterior. Following the revelation of their secret affair, the investigation intensified its focus on Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson. Their alibis for Monday were scrutinized more closely. Linda claimed to have been running errands, but investigators found inconsistencies in her account of where she was and when. Security camera footage from local businesses did not fully corroborate her timeline. Mark's alibi of being at work also came under scrutiny. While he was clocked in for part of the day, there were periods unaccounted for, and records of calls placed from his work phone at times he claimed to be unavailable or elsewhere. Further forensic analysis of the crime scene provided more direct links. Trace evidence recovered from the wooded area where Sarah's body was found included fibers and soil particles that were not consistent with the natural environment of the location, but were found to be consistent with the interiors of Linda Jenkins' car and Mark Peterson's car. Microscopic analysis linked specific fibers from Sarah's clothing to fibers found in the trunk of Linda's vehicle. This suggested Sarah's body may have been transported in her mother's car. Investigators also executed search warrants on Linda's home and Mark's residence. At Linda's house, hidden amongst cleaning supplies in the garage, they found a heavy, blunt object that appeared to have been recently cleaned. Forensic testing on the object revealed trace amounts of biological material that preliminary tests indicated were likely blood. At Mark's residence, detectives found clothing that appeared to have been recently laundered, and soil residue on his boots that was consistent with the composition of the soil at the discovery site. Witness statements also began to align in a way that implicated both Linda and Mark. A neighbor on Maple Drive recalled seeing Linda's car parked near Sarah's house for an extended period on Monday morning, earlier than Linda had initially stated she was there. Another witness, who lived near the wooded area where the body was found, reported seeing a dark-colored sedan, matching the description of Linda's car, parked suspiciously on the side of the road near the trail entrance on Monday afternoon. They hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after the discovery, the memory became significant. Phone records continued to be a critical piece of evidence. Analysis of location data from Linda's and Mark's phones showed their devices were in the vicinity of Sarah's home on Maple Drive, around the estimated time of her death. Later in the afternoon, both their phones pinged off towers in the general area of the wooded discovery site. The data suggested a coordinated effort, placing them both near the locations relevant to the crime at crucial times. Investigators began to formulate a theory of the crime based on the accumulating evidence. They believed Sarah had discovered the affair between her mother and Mark on Monday morning. This confrontation likely occurred at her home on Maple Drive. The discovery led to a violent confrontation, resulting in the blunt force trauma that killed Sarah. Following the killing, Linda and Mark allegedly worked together to remove Sarah's body from her home, transport it to the secluded wooded area, and attempt to conceal it, as well as clean up evidence. The motive, investigators theorized, stemmed from a combination of factors: the immediate panic of being discovered, the potential fallout for Linda's reputation and family relationships, and Mark's fear of losing his standing or facing consequences for the affair. It was a desperate act, born from betrayal and the catastrophic consequences of its exposure. The evidence, both digital and physical, was painting a clear picture of complicity. The case against Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson was growing stronger with each piece of evidence meticulously gathered and analyzed. The seemingly quiet suburb was revealing a hidden core of deception and violence. Based on the overwhelming evidence gathered, the phone records revealing the secret affair and coordinated movements, the forensic links between their vehicles and the crime scene, the discovery of the potential murder weapon at Linda's home, the soil evidence on Mark's boot and corroborating witness sightings, investigators were confident they had identified the perpetrator. Warrants were issued for the arrests of Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson. They were taken into custody separately, both appearing shocked but offering no resistance. Following their arrests, they were formally charged in the death of Sarah Jenkins. Linda Jenkins was charged with murder and tampering with evidence. Mark Peterson was also charged with murder and tampering with evidence, reflecting the prosecution's belief that they were jointly responsible for the killing and the subsequent attempt to conceal the crime. The charges sent shockwaves through the community of Westerville. The idea that a mother could be involved in the death of her own daughter, alongside the daughter's ex-boyfriend, was almost unfathomable. The betrayal at the heart of the crime added a layer of profound sadness and horror to the tragedy. Neighbors who had known Linda and Sarah for years struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the serious charges she now faced. Mark Peterson's friends and colleagues expressed similar disbelief and confusion. As the legal process began, both Linda and Mark entered pleas of not guilty. A grand jury reviewed the evidence presented by the prosecution and returned indictments against both individuals, formally moving the case towards trial. Pre-trial hearings were scheduled to address procedural matters, evidence admissibility, and potential plea negotiations, though initial indications were that both defendants intended to fight the charges. The prosecution meticulously organized their evidence, preparing to present the complex narrative of betrayal, conspiracy, and violence to a jury. Key pieces of evidence included the extensive phone records and extracted text messages between Linda and Mark, the forensic reports detailing the cause of death and the trace evidence linking them to the crime scene, and the transportation of the body, witness testimony placing their vehicles near relevant locations, and the discovery of the alleged murder weapon at Linda's home. The defense teams for Linda and Mark began formulating their strategies. They would likely attempt to challenge the interpretation of the forensic evidence, argue that the phone communications were misinterpreted, and potentially try to shift blame or argue for lesser charges. The case hinged on proving not just the affair but that the affair directly led to Sarah's death and that both individuals were involved in the fatal act or its immediate aftermath. The emotional weight of the case was immense. Sarah Jenkins, remembered by friends and family as a vibrant, kind young woman, had become the victim of a devastating sequence of events rooted in deception within her own family circle. The quiet sadness that had settled over Maple Drive following the discovery of her body now morphed into a public, painful reckoning. The upcoming trial promised to lay bare the most intimate and disturbing details of the case, forcing the community to confront the dark possibilities lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. The path forward was through the courtroom, a process that would dissect the final moments of Sarah's life and assign legal responsibility for her death. The trial of Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson began several months later in the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas. The courtroom was filled with members of Sarah's family, friends, and interested members of the public from Westerville. The prosecution's opening statement painted a stark picture: a secret affair discovered, leading to a violent confrontation and murder, followed by a desperate attempt to cover up the crime orchestrated by the victim's own mother and her ex-boyfriend. They promised to present a mountain of evidence, both digital and forensic, proving their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution began by calling witnesses who established Sarah Jenkins' life and character, detailing her routine and the last time they saw her alive. Cow workers testified about her absence on Monday morning. Friends spoke of her recent mood, acknowledging she had seemed troubled but not knowing the specific cause. Her father and other family members provided emotional testimony about the impact of her death and their search for her. Forensic experts were called to the stand. Emily Carter, the medical examiner, presented the detailed autopsy findings, explaining the blunt force trauma that caused Sarah's death and confirming the estimated time of death. Her testimony was clinical, yet the description of the injuries underscored the brutality of the attack. Crime scene investigators detailed the processing of the wooded area, explaining the evidence markers and the types of trace evidence collected. A BCI forensic scientist testified about the analysis of fibers and soil. They explained how fibers consistent with Sarah's clothing were found in the trunk of Linda Jenkins' car, and how soil consistent with the discovery site was found on Mark Peterson's boots. This testimony provided a critical physical link between the defendants, the victim, and the location where her body was found. The blunt object found at Linda's home was presented as evidence, with testimony detailing the presence of biological material consistent with Sarah's DNA. The lead detective on the case provided comprehensive testimony, detailing the course of the investigation from the missing person report to the arrests. They explained the significance of the phone records, presenting call logs and selected text messages between Linda and Mark. The messages were read aloud, revealing the progression from secretive planning to urgent communication around the time of the murder. The detective also testified about the inconsistencies in the defendant's initial alibis and how security footage and phone location data contradicted their statements. Witnesses who had seen Linda's car near Sarah's home on Monday morning and near the wooded area in the afternoon were called to testify. Their accounts, previously just observations, now served as crucial puzzle pieces, corroborated by the phone location data and forensic evidence. The prosecution systematically built their case, presenting evidence that outlined motive, opportunity, means, and attempted concealment. The defense teams cross-examined the prosecution's witnesses, attempting to poke holes in the evidence. They challenged the specificity of the fiber analysis, suggesting the transfer could have occurred at a different time or location. They questioned the reliability of witness memories, and challenged the interpretation of the phone communications, suggesting the messages had innocent explanations or were taken out of context. They raised questions about the timeline, suggesting there were opportunities for other individuals to have been involved. However, the volume and convergence of the different types of evidence presented a formidable challenge to these defense strategies. The weight of the collected data felt heavy in the courtroom. As the trial progressed, the narrative of betrayal remained central. The prosecution argued that Linda and Mark killed Sarah because she found out about their affair, and they panicked, fearing the exposure and the damage it would cause. They portrayed the subsequent actions, moving the body, cleaning up evidence, as calculated attempts to evade responsibility. The defense attempted to portray the situation as a tragic accident or suggest that one party was more responsible than the other, minimizing their client's involvement in the fatal act itself. The trial reached its critical stage as the defense presented their cases, which were brief compared to the prosecution's extensive evidence presentation. They called limited witnesses, primarily attempting to introduce alternative interpretations of the timeline or the evidence. Neither Linda Jenkins nor Mark Peterson testified in their own defense, a decision that observers noted but which was their legal right. The defense strategy seemed focused on creating enough doubt about the prosecution's narrative, rather than offering a convincing alternative explanation for Sarah's death. The final days of the trial were consumed by closing arguments. The prosecution reiterated the strength of their case, connecting each piece of evidence: the affair, the phone records, the fiber and soil analysis, the weapon, the witness sightings, to form a cohesive narrative of premeditated murder, or at minimum murder, committed during the commission of another felony, such as kidnapping or tampering with evidence. They emphasized the profound breach of trust and the cold calculation involved in trying to hide the crime. The defense closing arguments for both Linda and Mark emphasized the lack of a direct confession or a witness to the killing itself. They argued the evidence was circumstantial and open to interpretation. Linda's defense portrayed her as a distraught mother caught in a terrible situation, manipulated by Mark. Mark's defense suggested that while he may have made poor choices, he was not solely responsible for Sarah's death and that Linda may have acted alone in the killing, involving him only in the disposal of the body. They highlighted areas where the evidence wasn't absolute, urging the jury to consider reasonable doubt. The jury was then given instructions by the judge, outlining the relevant laws and the elements of the charges they had to consider. They retired to begin deliberations. The atmosphere in the courtroom and hallway was tense. The fate of Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson, and the final legal chapter of Sarah Jenkins' tragic story, rested with the 12 individuals weighing the evidence presented over several weeks. Hours turned into a full day, then into a second. Rumors and speculation circulated, but the deliberation room remained sealed, the process private. Finally, after 2 days of deliberation, a note was sent to the judge. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was called back into session. The defendants were brought in, standing beside their attorneys. The air was thick with anticipation. Sarah's family members gripped each other's hands. The jury foreman stood and faced the court. The question of who was responsible for Sarah Jenkins' death, and the dark secret that potentially led to it, was about to receive a legal answer. The clerk asked the foreman for the verdict on the first count against Linda Jenkins. The verdicts were read aloud, solemn words echoing through the silent courtroom. The jury found Linda Jenkins guilty of murder. They also found her guilty of tampering with evidence. The same verdicts were returned for Mark Peterson. Guilty of murder, guilty of tampering with evidence. Both were convicted of the most serious charges they faced. The reaction in the courtroom was one of quiet, heavy finality. Sarah's family members wept quietly, tears of grief and perhaps a measure of relief that those responsible had been held accountable. Linda and Mark showed little outward emotion as the verdicts were read, their faces pale and unreadable. Sentencing occurred several weeks later. Given the severity of the crime, the blunt force trauma causing death, and the attempt to conceal the body, the sentences were substantial. Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson were both sentenced to lengthy prison terms for the murder of Sarah Jenkins, with additional time added for the tampering with evidence charges. The precise terms varied based on state sentencing guidelines, but effectively meant they would spend decades, if not the rest of their lives, incarcerated. The legal process had reached its conclusion. The truth about the secret affair between a mother and her daughter's ex-boyfriend, and its fatal consequences, had been laid bare through meticulous investigation and presented in open court. The details of the betrayal and the violence were now part of the public record, forever attached to the names of Linda Jenkins and Mark Peterson. The community of Westerville grappled with the aftermath. The shock of the crime slowly receded, replaced by a lingering sense of sadness and unease. A young woman with a promising future had been taken violently, not by a stranger, but by those closest to her, in an act born from a web of deceit. Sarah Jenkins' house on Maple Drive, once a symbol of her independence and budding life, stood as a silent monument to the tragedy. Her garden continued to bloom each spring, a vibrant contrast to the grim events that had unfolded there, and in the quiet woods nearby. The devastating human cost of the crime extended beyond Sarah's life. Her family was irrevocably broken, their grief compounded by the unfathomable nature of the betrayal. Relationships were shattered, trust annihilated. The legal proceedings offered accountability but could not mend the emotional devastation left in the wake of the murder. Linda Jenkins, once a mother, now a convicted killer, was separated from her family and her life. Mark Peterson, the ex-boyfriend, faced a similar fate, his actions leading to ruin and imprisonment. Years would pass, but the story of Sarah Jenkins, the untouched lunch on the counter, the secret affair, and the shocking discovery in the woods, remained a somber chapter in the history of the quiet Ohio town. It served as a stark reminder that even in seemingly peaceful suburban landscapes, dark secrets and devastating conflicts can fester beneath the surface, sometimes with deadly consequences. The justice system had delivered its verdict, but the emotional and personal fallout of the crime continued, a quiet, enduring pain for those who remembered Sarah and the tragic circumstances of her death. Her absence was a permanent void.